My name is Evan Thornburg. I use she or they pronouns, and I will be talking about equity and inclusion. I am the Health Equity Special Advisor in the ACO division of PDPH. Next slide. So I'm just going to define some key terms because we have a short time together. I'm going to give us some key terms to work with together. We're going to understand equity over equality. I might cover bias a little bit. I'm going to definitely give you some resources. And I don't think there's time for Q&A in this presentation, but I will make sure that my information is passed along to you so that you can ask me follow-up things. Next slide. I always put these up because I want people to know that there are several community agreements that I have. The first one is no judgment. I am not here to judge you. I hope you're not here to judge anybody else in the cohort. If you are here to judge me, I will be totally honest in saying I am a grown up, and ever since we started working from home, I've been feisty, so I will survive that. So you're welcome to judge me. Fine. To leave what's said and take what's learned. So over the course of this presentation, people may share things in the chat. They may share things that are vulnerable enough from them. So what I want you to do is to take away the information, but to not take away personal stories and narratives, right? That's just gossip and kiki. That's not for us to be sharing. Feelings and facts. I try to do my best when it comes to presenting information, the facts of the matter. But I do ask that people respect them. I will respect your feelings. I'm not in the business of feelings. I'm in the business of information sharing. And feelings and facts can be oppositional, but still exist at the same time, and we can respect both. So, for example, I don't like pineapple in pizza, but there are people who eat that. One of those is my feeling. The other one is a fact, and they both coexist, much to my chagrin. And then to take ownership, if you share anything at any point in this presentation, just to take ownership instead of being like, that's nasty. I hate that, being like, I think, I feel, I believe. And then as you can see, it's a little cut off at the bottom, but to ask, share, and to laugh. I am definitely a goofball. And so I definitely encourage people to laugh. If I said something funny, it was intentional. Don't let me die on this stage. Or judge me, whatever. Next slide. So really quickly, there's a lot of words we see flying around. A lot of my favorite thing is the buzzwords of the times. And the first one is diversity. So just so we all have the same operational definition, diversity is the composition of a group, specifically whether or not different demographics are represented in a group. That's just who's in the room. There's two forms of diversity. There's acquired and inherent. Inherent are just the things about you that are immutable. You could not change these if you wanted to. You may not necessarily have a whole lot of information or knowledge on them. They're just who you are. Things like race, any form of identity that is very inherent to who you are. I would say gender identity, right? Who I am, who I identify as my gender. Like my culture, my cultural background, these are things I can't change. Those are inherent. Acquired diversity are the things that I can do to make myself more competent or inclusive or diverse. So that can be everything from learning a new language to understanding how Excel works. If you know how Excel works, please do not share it with me. I want to go to my grave not knowing about Excel because I struggle with it. And I'm going to admit my weaknesses throughout this presentation. Please enjoy. So what we know about diversity is that when a group has a good representation of both inherent and acquired diversities, it makes a group stronger and more profound and actually very good at problem solving. There's a 22% immediate jump in productivity when diversity is applied in a really expansive and equitable way. It's one of the things I love talking about diversity is I see a lot of diversity presentations that talk about like what's right, it's the right thing to do. And like, yes, that's true. But like, I like to talk about diversity being like a really key component to like how we operate on anything. What is found is that diverse communities or diverse teams are very good at problem solving, and they don't just solve a problem quicker, but they also find multiple ways to solve a problem, which I love, so that you have options in case one fails. So diversity is very important. Next slide. So inclusion, Inclusion is defined as a person or group of people's ability to contribute to and fully participate in a space. Inclusion is also the acknowledgement, celebration, and welcoming of individuals' sense of uniqueness and belongingness. Inclusion, so if diversity is who's in the room, inclusion is who gets to make decisions, who gets to speak, who's in charge. It's very important that these things go together. What we find is that when diversity exists without inclusion, all you have is just high turnover, right? Imagine if you are throwing a party and diversity is the people that you ask to come to the party, but inclusion is also like who's allowed to dance and like who's allowed to eat the snacks. If you invite people but they're not allowed to dance or eat the snacks, why would they be at your party? They're not staying. They're leaving. Because life is a party, is it not? We're all having fun right now, aren't we? But I think it's super important to make this point because a lot of times, a lot of places will really talk a lot about the diversity that they have. And I want people to start to ask them too, yes, but what's the inclusion look like? What does their leadership look like? Who gets to make decisions? Are people's opinions specific to the way we do things valued, no matter what echelon they are in? Could people in entry-level positions give feedback on larger scale decisions and choices, especially if they have good perspective or expertise, lived expertise? Inclusion is super important for diversity to even matter, pretty much, because otherwise you just have faces in a room and it's just a really good Benetton ad. Next slide. And so quickly, I want to take from anybody before we move forward some dated diversity concepts. It's not that these things were wrong. They weren't wrong at a point, but they're a little out of sorts now. Just like we no longer talk about jazzercise, we talk about Zumba, right? And so we're going to speed along, move along, because it's a little different. So color blindness is one of the first ones. It's a dated diversity concept, and it's the approach to organizational diversity that intertwines American cultural ideals, individualism, equality, and meritocracy. Color blindness is that concept of like, I don't see color, all people are human. It's the all lives matter conversation. It's not that this is wrong. I understand what you're trying to impart to a person when you're saying that. But when you say things like that, what it means is that you like someone in spite of their differences. And I want us to move to a space to understand that differences aren't good or bad. They're fantastic. But that a lot of times people have used differences to dehumanize or devalue others, right? So I don't want you to like me in spite of. I want you to understand that you like me because of. I identify as a queer Black person. My perspective in the world is entirely shaped by that experience, my life story, my history, how I came to do what I do, and what you come to like about me is based on that lens and that experience as those things. So color blindness is kind of not what we're doing anymore, or it's not interesting anymore because we're recognizing that we like each other's differences and we want each other to see those differences and we want to treat them the same. Tokenism is the accidental or intentional act of making an individual with a marginalized identity exclusive, representative in a space. So this is that like, it's okay, I have a friend who uses a wheelchair conversation. The problem with tokenism is that, first of all, nobody is the Lorax, nobody speaks for the trees. So having one person represent a whole community is too much pressure for that person, because even though communities share a joint or similar experiences, they're still made or comprised of individualized people, right? And that's really important to recognize. So my example for this is that a few years ago, I was sent on a trip by the State Department to Nepal. And one of the first things that one of the people on the trip with me asked to some of the folks that we were meeting was like, something about being Nepali. And the person that we were talking to was like, what does being Nepali mean? There's over 125 ethnic groups in a country of about 30 million people. And so being Nepali is expansive, right? No one Nepali person can say what being Nepali is. So it's that same idea of that tokenism. We can't have one person represent all people. And that's why it's also important that your diversity isn't singled down to one person. So if you have a group of 10, you're like, and one Black person, and that works. That's not enough. You do have to kind of really think intuitively about adding a larger substantial representation, because no one person can speak for everyone. Next slide. Intersectionality is the concept that people with a multitude of marginalized identities are having a specific and unique experience directly related to the overlapping of these identities, and that no one identity is being experienced or engaged with in exclusion to the others. So earlier I told you I identify as a Black queer person. I'm never having a day where I'm just Black or just queer or just assigned female at birth. I'm always experiencing those things simultaneously. And a lot of the experiences I have in the world, especially when it comes to engaging with oppression or bias in a system, is related to the intersection of those things. This idea was actually first talked about in print by the Combahee River Collective, which was a group of Black lesbians, and they talked about oppressions being interlocking. And if you ever want to read their manifesto, I think there's a way to download it online. See me later for that. Later on, you hear a lot of people attributing the concept to Kimberly Crenshaw, which is true. She's the first person to really flesh it out as a sociological concept. So just so you know the origin of this. Next. And equity is the centering of creating opportunities and changes to a space or system so that marginalization doesn't unjustly predict one's success and ultimately improves outcomes for all. So equity is our goal. And a lot of people want to ask me, Evan, why is it equity and not equality? Don't we want things to be equal? And that's a great question. So let's go to the next slide to better understand this. So what do we mean by equity being our goal versus equality, and why equality is no longer our goal? Let's say that I am some sort of wealthy, outlandishly wealthy billionaire. Capitalism, somehow I've participated. And I've decided, you know what? I'm having such a good time. I'm so glad to be alive and have all this money. I want to give back to the community. So I'm going to buy everybody a bike. In this community, there's 4 people. On the first line, makes it very easy. On the first line, equality, I've decided, you know what? I don't want anybody to feel like I treated them differently. So I bought 4 bikes, all the same bike. Everyone gets the same bike. Drop into the chat the problem you see with everybody getting the same bike. What has happened on that line? Not everyone can use the bike or fit the bike. Truly. The bikes don't work for everyone, right? One size doesn't fit all. Exactly. We all get the picture here. So the problem with this equality line is that the bike doesn't fit everybody, which means everybody can't participate. So already, let's just say that these bikes are for a race, because, you know, in capitalism, we're taught that we're all in competition with one another. The first thing we can see is one person is totally out. There's no way for them to succeed. That's just not possible. What do we see for the people who can ride the bike? We can see that they can ride, but the issue being is that riding a bike that doesn't fit you creates more work for you. So we're not saying that 2 other people couldn't theoretically win a race. But what we are seeing is that in order for them to win, they would have to work twice as hard and at the destruction, quite possibly, of their body. Like you see the person who's too big for the bike, riding that bike, the longer they ride it and the harder they ride it, the more damaging it is for them. And we see this a lot with marginalized populations and people when it comes to workspaces or participating in society, is that they have to work twice as hard for everything as simple as, like, if you've ever seen with public transportation, people who have ambulatory disabilities really struggle because, like, for instance, if they get on the train at one place, there's only so many stops they're able to get off where it allows for their wheelchair to, or accommodates their wheelchair for them to be able to get off. So a lot of times they have to get off blocks and blocks and blocks away from where they need to actually go. This means that they have to plan their day in a way that encompasses that adjustment. So this is the problem with equality, is that it still can have damaging effects, even if people are able to figure out how to make their resource work. Okay, so I've seen the error of my ways as the wealthy billionaire. Pray we all see that billionaires see the error of their ways one day. And dropping down to the equity line, I've decided that instead of giving everybody one bike, the same bike, I'm going to ask each person what kind of bike would they need. I'm going to assess their needs or how they best ride a bike. And I'm going to give them the bike that is built for them. What do we see occur on that line now? Everyone can participate. The second line is me and the individual. Exactly. Customized solutions. So why equity is our goal is because, first of all, as you can see, one of the big misunderstandings about equity when it's talked about is that it is going to be a unfair distribution of resources. Sometimes you see other images with people standing on boxes, and I don't like any of those because it gives the false impression that we should give far more resources to one person because they've historically not had resources or a certain amount of resources. And that's not quite what we mean by equity. A lot of people see that as money, like we should pay this group more because they've historically been underpaid. And a lot of people really struggle with that. What we mean with equity is as you can see, everybody got one bike. At no point in this exercise did I give anybody 2 bikes, 3 bikes, a car, nothing. Everybody got one bike. But in the second line in equity, I just made sure the bike was made for them. Now, does this mean that maybe the hand crank bike might have cost a little more than the smaller bike? Possibly, but ultimately we're all getting a bike. And there's nothing there's not an unfair distribution of resources here. Also, to understand that we engage in equity practices all the time, we just don't realize it. We all are accepting of equity practices. In fact, there are multiple people on this call right now who are utilizing an act of equity that some other people don't need to utilize. What do you think you're using right now to view this presentation that is an act of equity that not everybody has? Not even everybody on this presentation has. Glasses. It's not your eyesight. We are balancing out your eyesight, right? So that everybody can see kind of similar to one another. Some glasses cost a little more than others, but ultimately we all got one set of glasses on looking at each other. What are other acts of equity that you've seen in playing out in society? These are things that you don't necessarily use, but you know it makes it easier for other people.
Michelle mentioned a computer.
A computer. Senior discounts, right? Love those. Financial aid programs. Different sized urinals. That is not my area of expertise, but I support and I will take your word for it. Honestly, you could tell me there's dragons in there. I would have no idea. Curb cuts. Exactly. I think a lot of folks we think a lot of times of like disability access when we think of acts of equity. I'm very short and have a very tall husband. I love that for both of you. Everybody, a lot of times we think a lot about disability access, but there's other things too, like changing tables in public bathrooms, right? Not everybody's a parent bringing their baby in there, but they're in there. Now, I've never gone into a public bathroom and said to myself, why is there a changing table in here? Like, I've never snapped over that. Like, I don't care. It doesn't impede what I'm doing. It's important that it's there, though. Also, I'm going to lean deep into this and say, put them in men's bathrooms because men have children too. Anyway, so you all understand that in order to get to equality, we have to enact equity. That's how we're meeting that, because looking at that bottom line, everyone's able to compete now. And in fact, we can let competition go because that's a base of, very toxic capitalist design. And we can say that everybody on the bottom line, the equity line, can now collaborate, right? They don't even have to compete with one another because they all have enough access to what they need. Next slide. So these are the different ways that bias breaks down. There's explicit, there's implicit, there's affinity, and there's confirmation bias. Explicit bias is the overt and conscious belief that an individual or group based on their identities is unequal, undeserving, doesn't belong, or is less than. This is the obvious things. This is name calling. This is like clear dehumanization. We've all could point out an act of explicit bias. Maybe we've all been lucky enough to not see it, but Many of us have seen this and know immediately what it is, right? Um, implicit bias, the assiduous and unconscious belief that an individual or group based on their identities is unequal, undeserving, doesn't belong, or is less than. So implicit bias is things like microaggressions, right? Which was a very popular topic a couple of years ago. This is the stuff that is inherently taught to us, but we don't always consciously recognize or know. But it's been taught to us about other populations or groups. We all have these. It's just going to happen. They're going to pop up. And that's just a key component. We're always having to work on these. And I would encourage that even if you're not someone who harbors explicit bias, to think about all the ways that you could possibly be harboring implicit bias. Affinity bias is very difficult because it cuts two ways, depending on if you are a marginalized group or a privileged group. Affinity bias is used by marginalized groups often for safety. So this is like if you are a person of color and you've gone to a networking event, like a high exclusive networking event, and when you come into the room, you start to look for other people of color, right? That's affinity bias. You immediately are assuming that other people that look like you will be a comfortable place to fit in with, and you kind of gravitate towards them. This is if you identify as a woman and you've gotten onto the L late at night by yourself. Affinity bias is behind that. But this is also used by privileged groups to kind of make lazy decisions, as I like to say. Because you can immediately see yourself in someone who looks or seems like you. So you immediately assume that person is good or worthy of promotion or worthy of being heard or listened to. And I would encourage people to relinquish affinity bias, particularly when it comes to making decisions, especially if you are from a privileged group. And confirmation bias is the process of searching for and cherry picking proof and information that supports what we believe exclusively. So this is that argument all the time around Black on Black crime. The issue with the argument of Black on Black crime is that crime statistics or violence statistics, generalized ones, every group experiences violence internally at the highest rate, especially when you include things like intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And that's because people, by and large, mostly date monoracially or inside of their own racial groups and live within range of mostly their own racial groups. Communities are very insular. It's not to say that people aren't inclusive, but you're going to most likely experience violence in your community. And so it's probably going to be from someone with the same racial background. So that's confirmation bias to point out that Black on Black crime is the worst, when really it's everybody, every racial group in their own group, right? Nobody's talking about white on white crime, and I want to, pretty much. And everybody else too. Violence is terrible. Next slide. In the pyramid of bias, so that we best understand, is that bias is the belief or the idea. So let's say that I believe that people with a mental health diagnosis are dangerous. Prejudice is the positive or negative attitude, judgment, or feelings that are based in that bias or belief. So that's me thinking like, oh, people who have a mental health disorder or diagnosis are dangerous, therefore I don't like them. Bias can exist sometimes without an emotional investment, but it's still not, it's a belief or an idea, and it's usually harmful. And biases can be considered positive too, like believing like all Asian people are good at math. That's a bias, right? A lot of people are like, I don't see the problem with that. And the problem with that is the one Asian person that's not good at math is now held to a standard that they can't maintain, right? And it's also still generalizing based on race. There's nothing about somebody's race that makes them good at anything. Even if you're insular, like my entire family plays the piano, I am a dunce when it comes to music. Can't even whistle in tune, and I'm proud. Piano playing nerds. Don't tell my mom I said that. Prejudice, applying an emotion to it, is going to start to where your problem starts to brew. And discrimination is the action or behaviors that one takes based on that belief and those feelings. It's really important that you understand the pyramid of this, because a lot of times I give these presentations and people are like, well, I've been reporting this issue at work and no one's doing anything about it. And unfortunately, policy and legislation can only deal with discrimination, the actions that were taken based on these things. And so that means that something has to kind of build to an egregious point. Bias and prejudice are things that are kind of between people. And so we sort of have to deal with that in a interchangeably or interpersonally. And I like to make sure that people understand that someone having a bias doesn't mean that they have a prejudice, and we can always disrupt it or interrupt it. I think we want to be better at that nuance, because prejudice means that someone's got to buy it. They're bought in, they're emotionally bought in. So it's a little harder to teach them something different. But someone displaying a bias doesn't mean that they're unteachable or they're not correctable. And to recognize that when something's discriminatory is when we really want to take action, especially formally. Next slide. And the system breaks down to an individual, which is, if we use this example, your individual bias, that's how you feel. Institutional bias is where you work and like where you exist within. That might be a school structure, that might be a government structure, that might be a nonprofit structure. And structural or systemic is taking into consideration things like history and the effects of long-standing institutional bias. So when people are like, well, I'm not racist, that's like saying your apartment is clean. And I love that for you. But if your apartment building has giant toxic rats, then I'm not coming to visit still, you know, like I'm going to struggle to get there. And the question becomes, how long can you keep your apartment clean if your building with which you are living, that apartment exists in, has a pest problem? And then to blow it out even further, if your city is full of these buildings that has these problems, and we've built the city around accommodating the pests, right? And that's why we see things like why only 25% of the government is women or other marginalized genders, but women are 55% of the population, right? That's a structural or systemic bias that is born of a grouping of individual biases that became institutionalized, that built a structure that we have today systemically, right? Next slide. And so here's some statistics that I think are super important just to give you a sense of how this plays out in the real world. 55% of all women in senior level positions and 48% of lesbian identified women experience sexual harassment. 37% of Asian women think their gender is what has made it harder to get a raise or promotion. Recruiting, training, and retaining employees with disabilities is consistently found to be the lowest ranking priority amidst managers. People with hearing loss are twice as likely to be unemployed regardless of their education. The largest wage gap exists for employees with cognitive impairments, even if that cognitive, regardless of whether that cognitive impairment has anything to do with their ability to perform the job. And cognitive impairments is not always about like someone's ability to understand. It may also affect just their ability to like have a certain amount of control over their body. Asian, Black, and Latinx or Latina individuals who report higher levels of being on guard are also more likely to report sleep problems related to work. And so what we mean by that is like people being activated or people being prepared to endure something negative at work. And if there's anything we know about having sleep problems, is that sleep problems raise stress. Stress is the number one cause of health conditions that are cardiac related. One of the number one killers of women of color is cardiac related. So these things are tied to each other and they affect each other greatly or affect these pre-existing health disparities. 40% of Black employees report experiencing discrimination related to their ethnicity at work. And the cost of accommodations are listed as a key reason for dismissing a person with disability, either not hiring them or letting them go. The average cost of accommodating someone with a disability on a job is about $150 worth of change. So just so you put that in perspective, for $150 worth of change, that is everything from buying a special desk or adding a hand lever into a car. Those things are usually ignored, and it's preferential for people to let that employee go. Next slide. So what can you do? That was all very sad, Evan, thank you. What can you do? And I like to break this into the personal and the professional, because I told you in the beginning, I'm not in the business of telling what people to think, feel, and believe. The professional is policies, programs, paperwork, procedures, and I like to add another one here, which is pay equity. Look at your policies, look at your programs, look at your paperwork, and look at your procedures. These things are really easy places that you can kind of change stuff. You can immediately on forms change gender or make gender more expansive. It's not hard. You can have programs that are specific or cater to a marginalized population to make them feel safe. You can enact equity policies. Those are all things we can do. Proactive prevention instead of reactive response. This is simply about constantly, either passively or overtly, raising the competency amongst the people you work with. We do a series in my office that I am in charge of called Exploring Identities. And it's just a chance where I teach all of our staff about a different identity every month. And we talk about it, and we talk about how this affects HIV and HIV care, the disparities that those people experience. June is Disability Pride Month. It's LGBTQ Pride Month. It's Immigrant Heritage Month. So you got the next month coming up, a lot of time to get proactive and preventative and competent. Professional development and training. Don't let this 30-minute grab be the end of it. I encourage you to do more. To know people's rights, responsibilities, resources, and relationships. This is one of the more important ones for me because I really want to encourage people. A lot of people don't know their rights. And if you're working in communities, imparting to them their rights is super important. Right now, because I'm a jerk and I sometimes fight with the city, even though I work at it, I want you to encourage people to tell people about the change in the taxation, the property taxes. That's going to really affect our elders who own their homes and have, up until this point, have been experiencing through this whole pandemic, hopefully a lot more housing security. This is going to destabilize a lot of that. But they don't know what their rights are. So make sure you get that to them. Know your responsibilities to these people, know what resources you can provide, and build a relationship with them. In communication and conversation, make people collaborators with you. People can understand if you communicate the right way, and you can have a conversation with them. You don't need to be, again, the Lorax. You don't need to speak for the trees. You can collaborate with communities, and more we're seeing that, and it's very effective. In the personal, I give you my mother's words, which is to learn more and to judge less. She also tells me to talk less, but I took this job, so sorry. Step up, step back, and step in front is a statement that I really want to encourage people with privilege to consider. Step up is to know when you need to speak up because you see somebody missing at the table. Step back is when you see that somebody needs to use their voice instead of you and they need to be heard. So encourage everyone to fall silent and listen to them. And to step in front, know when it's really important to use your privilege to protect or shield someone. Learning the difference between where you apply these three is going to be super important. Watch your language is about being careful and always growing. For example, I hear people say this all the time, so I'm not shaming you, but when you say things like, that's so lame, that is a reference, and it's kind of ableist because it's a reference to people who were called specifically lame. Also getting rid of dated language like the term handicap. We're using accessibility or accessible, and we don't use lame anymore. So watching your language is also about growing competency around people and inclusive language. Hard on the issue, soft on the person is my favorite one because I think it's super important that we recognize when we can change someone's information or we can help or assist them out of an incompetent place or a bad place. You can be hard on an issue and still recognize the good in a person and be soft on the person. It doesn't mean we all have to become teachers, but consider that before you drag them on Twitter. You know, can you call them in, as it were? Can you send them a message and say, hey, I'd like to sit down and talk about that? And if you take nothing else away from this presentation, all I ask is that for marginalized folks, you listen to them, you believe them, you respect them, and then you do all you can to support them. Next slide. These are some really great resources. These are all my favorite things. The one side, the left side is just a group of really great resources where you can get really great research. The Kimberly Crenshaw TED Talk is 15 minutes and it's really brilliant to learn more about intersectionality. The other ones are good resources for research or for training on anti-racist practices or anything else that pertain to marginalized individuals in reporting. And then on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because we know all the people love the social medias, and I am a millennial, so of course I'm gonna give you that. These are really amazing accounts to follow and learn more about a number of different groups. I wanna point out Amani Barbarin because she's brilliant. She is a PA, a disability activist, and she's really brilliant when it comes to talking about communication and campaigns and media as well. And it's also Disability Pride. It's their 10-year anniversary. So follow them and learn about all the stuff they're doing next month. Yes, the uprooting white supremacy training. And there's one of those aorta trainers here located in Philadelphia. So very easy to get a hold of. Next slide. This is the last slide. This is just about me, sorry. Right up to time. If you have any thoughts, questions, concerns, you want to tell me I was great, you want to tell me I'm not so great, but you don't want to put it in the chat with your name. You just want to say just to me. You can email me at evan.thornburg@phila.gov. I'm over in the health department.